Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah rabbil
Join
alameen.
us in building a home.
Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Welcome back to your Tuesday Night Health Matters show from the Islamic Medical Association. And tonight we're discussing a very interesting topic which I'll introduce to you in a short while. But my guests tonight are Dr. Qasim Borat, an experienced clinical trial investigator and also sitting on the ethics committee at the Medicine Control Council. Assalamu alaikum, Qasim.
Wa alaikum salam.
And also Nathaniel Ramutanga, also very, very experienced in the, he's a medical scientist and years of experience in clinical trials, currently at WITS Clinical Research and also at the National Ethics Committee. Assalamu alaikum, welcome Nathaniel.
Wa alaikum salam.
We're discussing clinical trials, and we've been told in our Islamic teachings, and we often make this dua, even at school stage, we tell our children, you know, before you write exams, make a dua, Allahumma Rabbi zidni ilma, oh Allah, increase me in knowledge. But that knowledge, of course, is quite expansive and covers a wide spectrum. And in the medical fraternity, in the medical field, that increasing knowledge also encompasses doing research and trying to gain more and more knowledge about what we do and how medical science can improve the quality of life for the subjects and the people that receive that medical care. And the drugs that you actually buy off the counter and sometimes on prescription at the various pharmacies or given to you by the doctor, a lot of research goes into the development of that drug. And part of that is, as Muslims, our duty, as we say, Allahumma Rabbi zidni ilma, we also make another dua when we're drinking our Zamzam water, Allahumma ilman nafiya, oh Allah, grant me beneficial knowledge. So tonight we'll be looking at the background into clinical research as we try and gain this knowledge and provide some kind of quality of care to you, because that knowledge has to be beneficial and it has to be done in a professional and an ethical manner. So Dr. Qasim, perhaps I'll start off with you. There's a strong and good long history of research in Islamic scholars that have conducted research in the past. So although today clinical trials looks like a very Western type of invention, but that's not really true. Clinical research has been conducted many years ago, and we have a slide with Ibn Sina also that you've put up.
Jazakallah. I think Yaqub hit the nail on the head. We sometimes think that clinical trials is an innovation of the West. But if we look at Islamic history and the scholars, there's two prominent scholars. There's two prominent scholars, and the one is Razi, who was a Persian scholar in the 9th century, who actually designed the first clinical trial using two control groups. It was in meningitis, and he looked at the intervention of cupping. So that was the first described control group in terms of clinical trials. But the actual grandfather of clinical trials is Ibn Sina. And the slide,
we have a slide up there for that. Yeah.
The slide that you have is from his book, which is the Canon of Medicine, which was in the 10th century. It was a textbook that was used until the 1900s in some medical universities throughout Europe. He was a brilliant scholar. And he actually describes 7 principles, which we have up on the screen, which if we look at modern day clinical trials, these are the founding principles of clinical trials. He never executed a clinical trial, or there's no documentation of an execution, but certainly the theory behind it and the foundations of modern day clinical trials can be traced back to those 7 principles.
Alhamdulillah, that's very interesting and useful information. Nathaniel, when were the first clinical trials done? What's the first recorded clinical trials historically?
I think when you look at the history, maybe we can look at the areas like in the 1700s, to be precise, in 1747, when scurvy was killing a lot of sailors. And,
killing them?
Yes, killing them, because they were dying while they were sailing over, maybe from Dutch East India companies, those days when people were sailing over the world. Because of lack of vitamin C and all those kind of things, scurvy was a problem, and they were trying to elucidate as to what is the cause of that death, or how do we prevent death of the sailors that were dying. And James Lind did the first sort of scurvy trial. and the way he was testing orange and lemons to see what happens if we give some sailors lemons as a supplement. And in so doing, although they didn't call it a clinical trial, but the process, as Dr. Kasim has already indicated, it was typically the first sort of recorded trial that's really formed a proper trial, although it was not double-blind. It was just open label and testing of the lemons and oranges to the sailors.
But it's an example of comparing two products, which will work better and which one will have more benefit
more benefits, yes,
towards the disease that's at that time scurvy, obviously.
Yes, yes, and then you look at, and that evolution sort of like translated into some of the issues that came into in the 1900 times, where you look at the issues of pre-Second World War, when such studies were done by the U.S. government on syphilis in Negro males. In 1932, started in 1932. But the issue there is that even those trials, they were not necessarily with informed consent, so they were just happening. And even after the availability of penicillin around 1943, during the end or middle of the Second World War, 1947, when penicillin went on sale, those Negro males who were observed since 1932 to see the sequelae of the disease in syphilis were not given the penicillin even when it was available, until even 1972, when that study was stopped, just to see what happens with the tertiary syphilis when those patients sort of end up suffering the sequelae of the disease over time.
So that was obviously a violation of the ethics. Proper consent wasn't given. Those were disaster stories. It was a famous one. The Tuskegee, we've got a slide up there where Bill Clinton is apologizing for the gross horror and mismanagement and violation of human rights. Kasim, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, definitely there's a few trials that stand out in the history of clinical trials as landmark trials, and that shaped the future in terms of clinical trials to where we are today. And just to go back to James Lind scurvy trial, it was
the second picture.
It was conducted on the 20th of May 1747, which has become International Clinical Trials Day. So the 20th May of every year is International Clinical Trials Day. He is celebrated as the father. And as I pointed out in the history, we've also got a grandfather in terms of clinical trials. Yeah. Obviously, clinical trials has a checkered past. Like anything in history, there were good and bad examples, but we learned from them. And the Tuskegee syphilis study that was conducted in Negro males was a classic example where there were 600 participants. And 399 had syphilis, 201 didn't have it. And it started in 1932. And as Nathaniel mentioned, in 1947, penicillin became the recognized treatment cure for syphilis.
But they
this
were denied
study
that.
Continued to 1972, and none of the patients who had this disease were given any option to be treated. So that's the tragedy of the Tuskegee syphilis study.
And a lot of lessons to be learned from that, and also tells you that basically you can lose your way with clinical trials if you don't set out good boundaries, good ethical rules, and obviously in terms of the consent process, which we will discuss just now. And there has to be a transparency and in the relationship
100%.
Between you and the participant. In your jargon,
yes.
People use the word subject, but actually it's a participant. It's a partnership between the trial company or the people conducting the trial and those that are participating in it.
And I think another of the sort of landmark trials or sort of dark past of clinical trials happened during World War II, during Nazi Germany, the Holocaust. And what happened is the Germans then took advantage of prisoners that they held captive and experimented on them. So there was no consent, there was no mutual agreement because many of them were killed during the experimentation.
Right.
But it was purely for the Nazis to get their own benefit out of it. And they classified the studies in 3 categories. The first was they actually studied the physical elements and how Nazi soldiers could survive in those environments. So they were fighting in Russia where they were
Picture 5, please.
They were sub-zero temperatures. So they exposed the prisoners to hypothermia until the point that they died. They tried to rewarm them, and they looked at different methods of combating this physical condition. They also looked at injuries. So they surgically operated on people, broke their legs, implanted grass shrapnel, dirt, to make it look like a military wound, and then tested different treatments, but with no commitment that the well-being of their participant was ensured.
Okay.
So, and the last one, which is Joseph Mengele, Dr. Joseph Mengele, who was a war criminal, what he did was the third arm, where he tried to look at genetics, inheritance, and to prove that the Nazi race was superior to other races. So he did some horrendous studies on twins, one where he collected the eyes of twins while they were alive, and obviously these people suffered tremendously. So that's the sort of dark history, and it created learning lessons, and Nathaniel will go into a few of that in terms of how we then made sure never again this would happen.
Yes, of course, and so the introduction to tonight's talk is obviously a little bit of a horror story and a bleak thing, but obviously there is light at the end of the tunnel, and things have improved over time, which we will discuss in a short while, how these lessons have actually taught the industry to improvise and also to set a correct record and to put protocols in place, proper standard operating procedures in place, so that these type of scenarios are circumvented. But we will discuss that shortly in a short while after the ad break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to Health Matters. We're discussing clinical trials in South Africa today with our guests, Dr. Kasim Borat and Nathaniel, whom I have introduced earlier. And we started off with a very good introduction to clinical trials, but also at the same time a dark past. And perhaps just to set the scene before we move on to the real matter of what clinical trials currently entails. Kasim, historically, we spoke about the Nuremberg and the World War II scenario, the lessons we've learned. You want to just expand on that a bit?
Yes, Yaqub. I think the horrendous acts that were perpetrated in the World War by the Nazis resulted in the world sort of taking cognizance of where we are in terms of clinical trials, and they tried to hold people accountable through the Nuremberg trials, which ran in about 1947, and they came up with a code which was called the Nuremberg Code in 1947, which was a list of sort of principles in terms to guide clinical research, such that patients who wanted to take part had a say. They could provide what we call is informed consent, which we'll chat about a bit later, and that the treatments that were going to be used need to be safe, not detrimental to the participant, and if you pick up any negative consequences, then it's up to the doctor to stop that type of trial. So it was a basic sort of tenets of clinical research and good clinical research. In that same year, in 1947, doctors from 27 countries gathered in Paris, also in response to what had happened, and they formed the World Medical Association, which also released a guideline document which is called the Declaration of Helsinki, because it was in Helsinki, and that had principles again which spoke to the ethics of clinical trials.
Nathaniel, you want to add to that? Today we have things like good clinical practice and the Declaration of Helsinki and things like ICH. Want to explain that a bit? But before you do, I just want to mention to you that the lines will be open in a short while. The number will appear at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to call in on any questions on a very, very interesting topic. And we will also discuss how you could be a clinical trial participant, obviously if it's appropriate, inshallah.
Yeah, I think just to take it from Kasim in terms of the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, one sort of picks up an irony that the atrocities that were committed by government, not even by industry. So, and in so doing, I think that formed a pivotal role to sort of initiate something that was very ethical in terms of the World Medical Association trying to sort of establish the Helsinki Declaration in terms of it wanted to conform to accepted scientific norms, also designed, formulated experiments and protocol reviewed by an independent ethics committee to start. That's when really the start of really having ethics committees reviewing process of research in human beings started. And this, the importance of proportion and inherent risk, balancing the risk and benefit of participants, which was very important. And safeguarding the safety of the participants who are really lending themselves to advancing scientific knowledge and in a very altruistic manner. So, and you sort of start seeing that adequately they needed to be informed and their rights were protected. They were allowed to withdraw if they feel they don't want to participate anymore without being prejudiced, or still being allowed to be treated without any aspect of them being compromised in terms of their value public treatment that needs to find. And normally government also started taking that and putting into the laws of their countries. And this evolved over time, I mean, whereby it translated into the formation of the ICA GCP, which we have seen good clinical practice being adopted in the early 90s as a form of basis for conducting clinical trials worldwide and ensuring that the standardized process happens. Whether you're conducting a clinical trial in Timbuktu, in Mali, or in USA, or in UK, everywhere, the standard will be adhered to,
by which everybody has to comply
with. Yes.
And that particular standard is something that's all the time reviewed and audited and panel beated at times when anything new comes up. Kasim?
Yeah, so I mean, as Nathaniel mentioned, in the 1990s, the International Conference on Harmonization,
which is ICH,
took upon itself to advance the Nuremberg Code, and it developed it into a set of rules which are very extensive and is called GCP, Good Clinical Practice. And that is the standard against which any investigator, which is a doctor who does trials, any company that pays for trials, any government that's doing trials, is judged against in terms of the practicalities and the ethics of doing clinical trials.
So everybody that's involved in trial work has to be GCP certified, has to go for a course,
yes,
and has to continuously update that every 2 to 3 years.
It's every 3 years in South Africa.
Okay.
And the regulatory bodies, that's the government medical regulatory bodies in South Africa, it's the Medicines Control Council. In the United States, everyone will know the FDA. They sort of are the auditors, and they are the watchdog, for want of a better word, in terms of the clinical trials, and ensuring that good clinical practice is ensured for participants and for trials. But just to take a sort of an overview of this, I think it's important for the viewers to understand that in research, there's the scientific value and the scientific agenda that we want to answer, and then there's also the balance with the ethics and the respect for human life, and not taking advantage because of a position that you might have for someone who is vulnerable. So I think it's a balancing act between those two sort of principles. And scientifically, an example is if we know that a product is good for asthma, for example, and we're designing a trial to prove it, we cannot design a trial to show that it's better than nothing or than an inferior product. That is also bad science,
of course,
because you've just proven something is better than something you already knew.
That it's worse,
is the scientific question a valid one, and is it something that we need to answer to advance scientific knowledge? And then the ethics of it in that type of scenario, how do you expose a patient who has a disease, asthma, to what you know is an inferior product?
Correct.
So I think you have to balance that, and a lot of it speaks to integrity of individuals. Yes, you can have systems and checks and balances in places, but you also have to have people who have integrity doing clinical trials.
Well, in Islam we call it taqwa. It's the consciousness of Allah that you'll always be aware of, and that is, of course, brings your integrity, inshallah. The lines are open. Please do call in. It's a very interesting topic. I'm sure you have lots of questions for our two guests. But while we're waiting for your calls, take us through the process from beginning. What happens if somebody wants to participate in a trial, but obviously you've got different phases. So when is the trial started? Some kind of research goes on in the background. Some research occurs in the lab, and then it's brought on to human participation. And you've got some terminology that you guys use, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Nat, you want to take us through some of that quickly?
Yes, I think what is classical, maybe even before I take you to the phases of trials, just to sort of maybe for the benefit of the viewers, in that South Africa was one of the countries that had its first well-constituted ethics committee. Okay. The Vets Health Ethics Committee was established in 1965. So you can see it's long-term time ago, and following the Neurobank Code and the Helsinki Declaration, they realized the importance of having some form of ethical protection for our participants in this country. So you look at when a new chemical entity that is earmarked to sort of say it may have healing potential to patients or a particular disease, it gets tested in the lab in what we call preclinical, in that it's a process before you go even to a hospital or a patient level. In the lab, maybe they can use even animal studies to make sure that they test the toxicology aspect of the compound, the properties of the compound, so that by the time they try to sort of take it to the phase one, which is testing the chemical in healthy volunteers, people who are not necessarily sick, just to see what the drug does to the body and what the body does to the drug. Yes. So they test those kind of things. Instead of me using big terminologies, it's easier to explain it that way. Yes. And then once they are sure that those who were healthy didn't show any serious side effects, that's when they go to the first few patients that they can see to test the chemical to treat the particular patients who have got the disease. And normally, again, because you're still protecting the patients, you don't want to test too many of them until you are happy with the results that they are fine. So, and then from then you go to your phase two after that, where you go to the large number of patients who you test. And then from then, what we get as package insert at the pharmacy, it's usually information of the early drug that comes from what we call the phase three, whereby a large number of patients are then tested after you have satisfied the phase two data that you are happy with what you have seen there. And once it goes to phase three, those results are accumulated, the safety profile, all the adverse events are recorded in one place, and to ensure that you inform those who are going to be taking the drug and those doctors who are going to be treating the patients once that medicine is registered and it's being sold to everybody who's the patient who needs the disease. But so it doesn't end there. It goes to phase four, where the post usage assessment
in the market
and monitoring when it's in the market is called what we call phase four. So there's continuous surveillance to ensure that whatever is seen then when it's being taken by everybody, then is recorded, is reported to the regulator, is reported to whoever, the sponsor or the owner of the drug as a company, so that it continuously being updated to say these are updated safety matters.
And if there are problems, then necessary interventions take place. And the regulatory body here that oversees everything is the Medicine Control Council and the Ethics Committee, where the two of you are sitting on. Okay, so Kasim, for a person to now, he comes in and you are a clinical trial doctor, you're in the field. What is the process? What happens? You get a program, a drug that's coming to you, you call it a protocol. You now have to recruit some patients. Some patients have to come in and participate. How does the process start? What's the beginning of everything?
Okay, so I think it's important to just re-emphasize that there's a wealth of data that's collected before it's even tested in the first healthy humans. So I think, and the first exposure to humans is called a phase one trial. So that's done in a specialized unit, usually a hospital setting. Patients are monitored 24/7 because it's the first time it's being used in humans, and we don't know, even with the wealth of data, we don't know exactly how the body is going to react to it. So what we do is what we call phase two and phase three studies, which is basically for people who have the disease that is being looked at, and this is a possible treatment or intervention for that treatment. So patients, I mean, in my practice, we have a general practice attached to the clinical trial center, so we would identify possible patients based on our database review. We'd identify patients who've got high blood pressure, for example.
We'll just take an ad break and we'll continue from that, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to Health Matters. We're discussing clinical trials tonight with Dr. Kasim Barat and Nathaniel, who's from the Ethics Committee and the Ethics Board at the South African National Ethics Committee, and also at BITS Clinical Research. We're discussing very the process. We spoke about the background, what goes in. Kasim, I interrupted you before the ad break, and you were just telling us what kind of process takes place for someone to get involved in clinical trials at a patient level. And the most important component of that is, of course, the consent that they give you. But before you answer, I just want to mention that the number is at the bottom of the screen. Please do call in for any questions that you may have regarding clinical trials, and our guests will happily answer them for you.
Yeah, so as we were saying before the break, you know, if a patient has a specific disease like hypertension and is being treated at a practice where there's doctors who do clinical trials, then they might call the patient or see them during a consult and say, we are doing this clinical trial. We would like to invite you for a discussion which is around the trial to see whether you would like to participate. And that discussion and that process is what we term informed consent. So it's a legal requirement, it's a GCP requirement.
Picture 8.
It's a GCP requirement, and it's critical because at my site that takes approximately an hour, where as an investigator, as a doctor who knows this specific trial that we want to do in hypertension, you would go through the ins and outs of the trial with this patient from start to finish. What are the benefits of being involved in clinical trials? Why would you want to take part? So obviously there's the altruistic intention of some people where they want to contribute to science so that future patients might benefit. That's obviously some people's motivation behind taking part in trials. Others are for benefit for themselves. There might be certain medication which is not yet launched or released in South Africa, and this is a way for access. There's additional time spent by a doctor in terms of education and ancillary benefits that a patient could be attracted to as well. So I think there are benefits. What are the risks? Every study has risks, and it varies from study to study. If you're doing an oncology study in a terminal cancer, for example, the risks and the side effects could be quite significant. Whereas if you're doing a hypertensive study, we don't expect the same sort of weighted risks. So I think once you go through the informed consent with the patient, they need to understand what's being explained to them, the good and the bad. And remember, having a package insert in a medicine that you buy at a pharmacy lists a whole lot of adverse events that were collected or side effects that were collected in clinical trials. It does not mean you will get those side effects, but the possibility is there and the percentages of patients are affected, and we collect that data in clinical trials. At the end of that discussion, the patient would then make a decision that yes, this is something for whatever reason that they found they would like to take part in or not. The important note on informed consent and the decision to take part is that it is completely voluntary, and the patient has the right to withdraw at any stage for any reason. I think it's not like an MTN contract that you sign for 2 years and you don't have a way out of it. I think even if you sign today and tomorrow you sleep on it and you change your mind, you are entitled to withdraw without giving a reason and without having your medical care prejudiced. So it does not mean that doctor can be upset with you and now say, no, hang on, I'm not even going to treat you in practice or have a negative attitude towards you because you decided not to take part in a clinical trial.
Nathaniel, you want to add something to that?
No, I think what I would like to add is that many times is that we don't realize that patients in clinical trials represent some of the best protected patients.
Yes.
In any country, because of the informed consent, and also the number of stakeholders that are overseeing and protecting the patient. The regulator in South Africa, we've got the Medicines Control Council that regulates and approves that trial and makes sure that every documentation is approved, is reviewed and approved. You've got the ethics committee that will look at the ethical aspect of that particular trial to ensure that patients and participants are protected. At the same token, you've got the sponsor who in many times will have their own monitors or even their own internal ethics within the sponsor to ensure that whatever is happening there, it's penultimate to the protection of the participants who are participating, who are helping mankind to advance science and knowledge. And I think that is very important for patients who participate in clinical trials to realize that they are the most protected patients. And even knowledge-wise, when they come out of this trial situation, they are highly informed about the disease area, and also even understanding the process itself. To say, many times if you interview a patient who's been in a trial, they will brag about the fact that they felt like they went to a place where somebody knew their name. Even when they were coughing, somebody wanted to know what was going on with them. So, which was very important to make sure that
they're treated very much more specially, and much more attention is given to them. Just explain the terminology sponsor to the viewers.
The sponsor is usually the company that has discovered that chemical entity or drug or medicine, which it then sort of wants to advance in development in terms of research, so that one day it can be registered as a fully fledged medicine that is registered by a regulatory body. In South Africa, as I indicated, the Medicines Control Council. In the USA is the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration body that regulates that process.
The lines are open. Please do call in. We're waiting for your calls. Kasim, so you've done the informed consent, but there's different types of trials. People spoke about comparing drugs, a weaker product and a stronger product, a new one or an equivalent. There's a lot of medical jargon that goes on into these things. A randomized control trial and a double blind and a placebo. You want to go through some of those terminologies and those concepts?
Correct. I think the informed consent is there to also do that on a one-on-one.
Picture 11.
One-on-one level. I think the informed consent is a continuous learning process, and Nathaniel is spot on when he says that the benefits in terms of time that the doctor can spend with the patient, the attention that a clinical trial subject gets, is one of the reasons patients say they take part in studies, because they learn about their disease. Diabetes, for example, what to eat, what not to eat, that goes as part and parcel of it. Yes, we should be doing that in normal practice, but given the pressures we are under, funding pressures, time pressures, it's very difficult to do that in practice. So this avenue allows for that. But a double-blind clinical trial basically means...
You got a little curtain up there.
Yes, It doesn't mean that the doctors are blind, like as
and
indicated.
the patient is not blind.
But they figuratively blind to the treatment. So if we're comparing product A and product B,
you don't know what is there.
Now, what happens is the sponsor, who's the person who's funding this research, has product A, which is theirs, and product B, which is someone else's, and they want to prove that product A is better than B or the same. Therefore, they can register it. That's the aim of the research. Now, if the tablets looked different when you give it to a patient, the patient would know what they're taking. If they see a certain tablet, which is blue, they know it's tablet B, and if it's white, and a different shape, it's product A, and then that creates what we call a bias, which is something that's introduced into the research and creates results which are not really true. Because if a patient knows product A is going to be better, we're telling them it's a new product, it might work. If they're taking A, it will influence their body and their mind in terms of how they respond. So double blind means product A and product B has to look, feel the same. Even though they're completely different products, they are now manufactured in a way that they are physically identical.
We have a caller on the line. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Go ahead with your question.
Okay, I'd like to ask the doctors about has any clinical trials been performed on somebody where certain drugs, when you lower the dose, it would work better in the body than increasing the dose?
So you want to know if the trial is being done where the dose, a lower dose will be more beneficial than increasing the dose. Is that your question?
Yes, depending on the individual, yes.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
I think that's an important principle in research, because we need to know what's the lowest dose that will work in the majority of patients, okay? So in terms of clinical trials and the way it's designed, phase 1 gives us, the early trials in humans gives us a lot of data on that. And then usually they have a phase 2A, early phase 2 study, which is to work out the optimal dosing range. So there are trials where you're not comparing product A to product B, but you're comparing 4 different doses of product A in a person. So you're looking at the lowest, because ideally the medical principle is you want to have the lowest therapeutic dose, so the dose that works because it has the least side effects
and the maximum
benefit. So trials are always done in the early phases to identify the correct doses. And that's when it gets to market, we have a range. We say it can go from 5 milligrams up to 15 milligrams. Yes, in an individual there might be a better response to a 5 milligram, and in some individuals might need the 15 milligrams. So it's hard to give a specific answer, but that is taken into account in the design of studies.
Does that answer your question, brother? Jazakallah for the call. The lines are still open for calls. That was a very good call, a very good question. So you're explaining the concept of double blind. Then you also got the concept of placebo, where it is like a blank. And I know people don't like it, but it does exist.
The placebo is a very important part of clinical
12 and
trials.
13.
It's a very important part of clinical trials, and it's also something that as scientists we can't explain fully. So the theory behind the placebo effect, or what happens, is that you're now comparing product A instead of to product B, you're comparing it to a blank tablet. So it has no active ingredients. It's something that if you drink shouldn't do anything. But if we have a painkiller for headaches, product A and product B, and B is the placebo, we give 100 people one and 100 the other.
Just 12 and 13, please.
What we find is that even the patients who are given the placebo, which means they were given a blank, the headaches go away in a certain number, up to 60% response. And that is not yet explained, but they obviously postulate that it's related to the human mind, the body's ability to heal itself, perception, and how you feel a certain intervention is going to help you. So it's a very tricky one.
Your comment?
Maybe I can come in here.
Yeah, sure, definitely.
I liken the placebo as like faith.
Okay.
You get healed by believing that I'm going to be healed.
Yes.
So and you get better because you have believed that it will happen. It's a positive thinking. So even when it's, as Kasim has indicated, that a placebo doesn't have anything active, but you take it and you still see a 60% positive effect, which means that it's in the mind, somebody believed, and it happens.
Okay, so on the note of a blank, we'll take a ad break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back to Health Matters Comprehensive Chat. We're discussing clinical trials with Dr. Kasim and Nathaniel, medical scientist. We've been through quite a bit of information process. You gave us the dark checkered history of trials and how it's improved, and the standards that are now being employed, which are pretty high standards in South Africa, is in keeping with the international standards, both from a science perspective and also from the ethical. The lines are still open. Please do call in. We have a caller, and a good start to the next section. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Gee, brother, go ahead with your question.
Cheers. My name is Samir Manju, calling from Tanga, Quadribuza.
Gee.
I would like to get this from a doctor's perspective, actually.
Gee.
Okay, so I understand that the trial consists of various phases, which is used to identify the performance of the drug that is prescribed. Now, if side effects are evident, what would then be the procedure?
You want to know about side effects?
Gee. If the procedure, what would be the procedure if there are side effects present in the first or second phase?
Okay. Qasim?
Okay, that's a good question. And I think if you look at the data that's being produced by studying the drug, you may find negative findings or side effects, meaning that the medicine causes unintended consequences. Now, what happens to that product really depends on the severity of those consequences. Obviously, if it resulted in something as severe as death or severe cardiac problems or anything that's life-threatening, that would really limit and possibly stop the development of that drug from an ethical point of view and a regulatory point of view. So if that is picked up and it is severe, it most likely would not be a product that would make to market. All medicines have side effects. Everything. If you have a side effect, and if you look at the package insert of any medicine, if you look at Grandpa, which is available at every garage in this country, it causes peptic ulcers, it causes asthma, it makes high blood pressure worse, yet it's available because those side effects, we know the incidence, and not everyone is going to get it. So it's important to know the side effects, and the prescriber, who's your doctor, should then be aware of these and take that into cognizance when he's prescribing medication for you. So it really depends on the severity of the adverse events or the side effects that are discovered, because that could limit the product's marketability at the end of the day and the safety, or it could be something that we're willing to tolerate. If, for example, we're looking at a drug for a terminal cancer, obviously then we would look at the risks in light of the benefit. If there's no known options for this particular cancer, we'd be willing to accept more serious side effects because there's no other option.
But at that point, if I may intervene, so the brother is asking what happens when the side effect is discovered. So on the one-to-one interaction with that particular participant, he comes in and he says, look, I've got a severe abdominal pain, I cannot bear this pain anymore. What would you do at that individual basis? You're talking about the overall, whether it will be withdrawn and the data that will be collected and the number of side effects.
Correct.
But on the one-to-one, does he have the option to withdraw? Obviously he'll be seen by the doctor, examined, see how serious it is.
Yes. So I think definitely he has the option to withdraw, and that's at any stage. Whether he's had an adverse event, a side effect or not, he's entitled to withdraw.
But in relation to this.
But if he develops an adverse event and that's why it's very important not to sort of run away from the doctor and have a sort of poor communication. That doctor who's studying, who's conducting this trial needs to know what's happening, so that he can then say that in the body of evidence for this specific medicine, we know that it can cause severe abdominal pain, for example. So if that had to happen, then we would then look after that patient and investigate it further. I mean, in terms of the side effects, let me just put this in context. If you are on a clinical trial and you get knocked by a bus, that is considered a side effect of the medication.
Okay.
It is listed as a side effect of the medication. Okay? Because it happened while you were taking the medicine. Now, is it related? Possibly not. Possibly yes. Let's say it's a drug that causes a bit of dizziness. And you're walking across the road and you don't see a bus because you are dizzy. So it's very important that the investigator or the doctor that you go to is thorough in terms of assessing the adverse event with the body of evidence and making a decision, do we think it's related to this drug or not? And then that patient has to be looked after. If he has a negative consequence that may have medical costs, that has to be covered if it's directly related to the medication. Every trial that is covered, apart from the regulations and the oversight that Nat mentioned, has what they call insurance. So the sponsor has to take out a specific insurance for a specific number of patients in South Africa that will cover patient care and additional costs in the event of something like that where it's directly related.
Okay, that's quite a thorough explanation. Brother, does that answer your question? Okay, he's off the line, but inshallah, I think you have answered the question. You can call in again if you want to add to your question, brother. Nat?
I just wanted to add as well that if the patient reports to the doctor with side effect, the doctor will also assess whether that side effect has only been seen with that one particular patient, or the doctor is seeing it with other patients. Yes, and because everybody has got what we call idiosyncratic cause.
Yes.
You know, one person may experience it, but the other 10 may not. Yeah, and
so you have to have a broader global view of the whole thing.
Yes, so then the doctor will make an assessment and make a decision whether it's at the request of the patient to withdraw, or whether the doctor can assess and say, look, as his own medical assessment, he decides to say, I'm going to withdraw this particular patient from this trial for their safety and their well-being.
And the scientific committee at the sponsor level, at the end of the phase 2, will collect all the data, measure everything, measure the risk if they're going to go on to the next stage, because that's a continuous process that takes place.
Yeah, so the investigator or the doctor doing the clinical trial, it's his responsibility to be up to date with the global safety data for that specific drugs, not just his site and his patients.
Which he gets informed about.
There's regular updates.
All right.
And then on top of that, there's what we call data safety monitoring boards. It's another oversight, usually independent of the sponsor. The sponsor pays for it, but it's independent, and they make independent decisions on the safety and the product, and they might even call a study to early completion. They say, no, hang on, the risks, we're picking up flags, which were there before, but now they're coming stronger. We would like the study to stop irrespective of what the sponsor would like to do. Right. So there's independent oversight, which I think is critical to understand.
Okay, I mean, that was a very good question, and it's led us to a lot of other discussion on this matter. Anything else you want to add when it comes to the side effect at a practical level? You call it adverse event.
Yes.
And whether it's related and not related, you make a judgment call. You want to add something more to that, Qasim?
No, I think it's important for patients who are participating in a clinical trial to understand that they're entering they're putting their disease and their life under a microscope. and the doctor would like to know everything that happens to you. If you had flu 3 weeks ago and you took Advil CS or whatever you took, the investigator or the doctor would like to know about it, and we document it. We report it so that that data, you're talking of an individual level, but remember, studies are done on a global level. So one study that I'm participating has 15,000 participants across the globe. So if we suddenly see 15,000 influenza cases at the same time, or a similar headache, we need to look at it.
We have another caller, sorry, Qasim. Assalamu alaikum. Go ahead with your question.
Ask one more question. It's about what is the percentage-wise before they release the drug? You see 200 patients coming for a trial, and then maybe 5 patients react. Would the drug still be released public?
Yeah,
you understand?
Yeah. I think, 5 patients react. When you say react, you mean depends on the severity of the reaction, obviously. Yeah. So if it's a severe reaction, and even 5 out of 200, that information gets put into the global knowledge of that trial. So there might have been previous trials which showed 1 out of 200, and this is higher. So this would raise a flag. And remember, so let's say you collect all the data over a period of 15 years. You've studied this drug in like 20,000 patients, and you've got a dossier. Now you have to submit that dossier to the health authority of each country for a license to market your product, to sell it. Now, and Nathaniel sits on the MCC, I do as well, at that stage, the independent health authority would go through your dossier and pick up. They say, now hang on, in these studies we saw 5 per 200 having a severe side effect. We are not approving this product for registration. You cannot sell this product in South Africa. Or they might register it with strict conditions as to who can and can't have it. Maybe those 5 who reacted negatively had a certain peculiarity. They had a certain disease or were on other medication that made them at high risk for that. So it really depends on the scenarios. But remember, the ultimate step for registration before you can actually get it from a pharmacy or a doctor is the independent health authority of that country, who is very strict in terms of registration.
Does that answer your question, brother? Jazakallah for call. That brings us to an example of what happened to a drug called Vioxx, because it was registered, was in the market, and then withdrawn. Do you want to go through that?
I think Qasim can take that.
Yeah. I think Vioxx was an interesting...
it was used for arthritis, right?
Yeah, it's a painkiller produced for arthritis. It's one of the new tablets that had less of the side effects of stomach ulcers, etc. So it was punted as a very good chronic medication for arthritis and for pain relief. And what happened is it was actually launched, so it was approved by the FDA in 1999, and as Nat mentioned, there's still ongoing surveillance by the health authority, and in the 5 years post-registration, that in 2004 it was recalled, so its registration was rescinded. And why that happened is they picked up that post-registration patients were developing heart attacks.
Okay.
And they've documented 50,000 heart attacks in that period of 5 years. So obviously your surveillance by the health authority is only as good as their program and how they do it. But in the United States is very good, and they have a good reporting system. So they picked up that this product caused heart attacks, and there was a massive lawsuit, and the company was sued and had to pay out. But it was rescinded in terms of registration. So it's not a perfect system. I think like anything in life, it's not perfect.
Correct.
But it's
an example of the ongoing surveillance.
Yes.
We're almost at the end of the program, and how quickly time goes. Just a quick messages from you guys. If people want to participate in trials, what do they do? Who do they contact? Where do they resource this kind of information?
I think the first step would be if they have a disease that they feel that they might benefit from a clinical trial, or they're interested to speak to their primary doctor, their doctor that looks after their health, who knows their history and can advise them.
Some useful context on the screen there.
I think in terms of the contacts that are there, that's the MCC, which is the South African Health Authority. You've got the clinical trials register. So any trial registered in South Africa or being done in South Africa has to be registered on the South African National...
So they can access that,
yes.
And if they feel they have a particular condition, they can contact...
So it lists the conditions, it'll say hypertension, it'll say infectious diseases, diabetes, whatever. You can click on that, you can get more information about who's the sponsor, who's doing the research, and you can search for opportunities to get involved. But it's not something that everyone should run and do.
Yes, of course.
It's something that, it's a measured approach, and it's, as I said, there are reasons to take part, and you must be clear on the reason that you want to take part. and then it'll work.
Nat?
No, I think the most important thing is just to make sure that they're able to sort of reach out to their primary treating doctor, who will then educate them. Because even today, with the advent of the social media,
yes,
people can search and learn more, so that by the time they go and see their doctor, they're able to ask relevant questions. They
yes,
can also approach any ethics committees within their region, their province, to learn more, and then also be informed, because there's nothing so good and brilliant than a well-informed patient who walks into a doctor to say, I would like to participate in this particular trial.
You mentioned about social media. You have some views on that?
Well, I think it's important that we said that every trial in this country has to be registered by our Department of Health, which is the MCC, has to be registered by an ethics committee as well. Now, the ethics committee goes one step further. They even approve the sort of advertising or information dissemination to the public. So I think when you get a WhatsApp message or a Facebook page that's talking about trials, be very skeptical, because those trials and that type of information is usually not approved by an ethics committee. So get involved, as that says. You know, I tell my patients, if they're suffering from diabetes, it's not my disease, it's your disease. It's your HbA1c, you're going to suffer the consequences and the complications of either good or bad care. So empower yourself. And the more you know, the more comfortable you'll be to participate.
Excellent, and a very, very informative topic and information that you guys have come. Jazakallah for coming on. I don't know if you want to give any take-home message as we conclude the program for tonight.
I think the take-home message is that if those who want to participate in clinical trials, it's a safe environment. They've got enough stakeholders that protects them to participate. But as Kasim has mentioned earlier, they need to inform themselves. An informed participant enjoys going through the process and also understand the disease better. And also it benefits the country going forward, because most of the time participating in clinical trials gives access to patients for medicines which sometimes they may not have access to. Even though the main aim is not to treat and then cure, but in many disease areas, if there's an outbreak of influenza or infections or whatever, they will be treated to cure levels, and that it's access in itself, and also it's also medical education at the same time.
I think the benefits of clinical trials to South Africa are enormous. It's benefiting our healthcare system, it's benefiting our patients. But I think I'll sum up with one advancement made. If we look at antiretrovirals for HIV in this country, if we looked at 15 years ago, patients were taking approximately 13 tablets a day with severe side effects, difficult tablets, difficult regime to stick to. Today, it's now summarized into one tablet once a day.
And that's because of the ongoing research.
And that's an advancement in terms of clinical trials. So it simplifies people's lives and it advances our healthcare.
Jazakallah khair, gentlemen. Really lovely having you here. We hope to bring you back again if we talk about another clinical trial program, maybe a part 2. And to you, the viewers, Jazakallah for viewing and participating. And until next time, Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.